So Monday's class, we were talking about incremental change. And I gave you guys the definition of incremental change. What did I say was the definition of incremental change?
Putting certain resources and time and effort into certain levels of what you want to do in the end game.
Well, not just that. It's not just putting those necessary resources into play. The additional piece of that is being able to make change on a gradual level. See, you have to compare incremental change with gradualism, because you don't want to just suddenly shock the system and start changing things. You want to be able to do it piece by piece by piece by piece, so that it doesn't mess anybody up or kill somebody's vibe. Make sense? You want to do it where you try to ruffle as minimum amount of feathers as possible, right? Because, as Alex said earlier, we want to do things in a peaceful manner and not with violence and rampage and anarchy, and we don't want an overthrow, right? So we also talked about what is change. And we talked about changes in the roles that federal, state, and local government play. We talked about shifts in public policy. We talked about how agendas change. So you've got to go with the flow of what's going on in your necessary area, environment, or arena. You have to be able to be like a chameleon. Anybody in here who knows what a chameleon is, you have to be able to adapt to whatever setting you're in. And it is important to be able to create incremental change and be able to adapt to whatever situation or environment that you're in. We also talked about alterations and intergovernmental relations. So we talked about the relationship of how each of these different governmental agencies are cogs. And they're all working together for the simple objective of making the government function. Whether you are at the federal level, whether you are at the state level, or whether you are even at the local level. Am I making sense? So within that, when you alter the intergovernmental relationship and you're trying to make these changes, you are now creating a shift in the dynamic of how effective you can possibly be. Because remember, what are our three goals of government? To be effective, to be efficient, and to be, say that louder? Responsive. Bingo. Change in power and influence of citizens and groups. What happens when you give people more power? You give them more power, guess what? They feel more enthused to be able to make decisions. We talked a little bit about voting. What happens when people feel empowered to vote? They are actually able to make change. They are able to either vote people in and out of office. They are able to vote on certain referendums, certain amendments, certain agendas. Whatever the core agenda and mission is, when people are united, they are a lot more powerful than people that are apart. Make sense? And the last piece is what happens when your obligations vary. So whatever you commit to, whatever you give your promise to that you are and are not going to do, is definitely an example of how change comes about. Because when you change up that dynamic, either things can go very well or they can go south very quickly. So we talked about a need for integration, and we talked about why there is a need for change. particularly in metropolitan areas. So we talked about as more people move into a metropolitan environment, guess what? Needs change. You need better housing. You need better transportation. You need better access to food. You need better resources. You need more jobs. You need to make sure the roads are paved. You need to make sure that there's not people bumping in and off of you when you're walking up and down the street. You may need more security. Bless you.
Thank you.
We talked about how growth does not necessarily mean that things are consolidated, but growth does have that unfortunate stigmatism with meaning that our governments, instead of coming closer together, they actually separate more, becoming further apart. And unfortunately, in times of an increase, that also means that you lose sight of what your overall purpose and agenda really are. Make sense? You then talk about an increasing diversity in population. So when you live in an area that is not just made up of one culture or one race, when you have the masses all living together at the same exact time, you now have to be able to meet the needs of your population. If you have more senior citizens living in a particular area, Laura, just like where your brother is in Tampa, in Florida, that's not just known as the Sunshine State, but that's also where senior citizens go to retire. So now that you have more senior citizens living in that area, you have an increase in those amount of residents, but guess what? Your needs now shift. So you have to make change in order to accommodate that particular audience. Am I making sense? If you have a younger population, how many of you plan to stay in New York after you graduate?
Depends.
Where do you want to go?
I kind of want to see the South. Or
What-
maybe West Coast. I'll see.
What part of the South?
I don't know, I have some family in, if you want to consider Virginia the South, what technically it is. Yeah.
Okay. What about our resident Mandarin speaker?
Georgia,
What part of Georgia?
Alpharetta.
Okay, that's about an hour from Atlanta. I've stayed in Alpharetta. Do you have family down there?
My brother's considering moving there, so I like to be close to him. I like the area. He's looking at houses down there.
Okay. How many of you would want to stay in New York? Arvella, you going to go back to Philly?
Yes. From.
Without any question or hesitation?
Any other place I would go is DC.
Okay, why DC?
I think it's the prettiest city I think I've seen.
You think DC is pretty?
The parts I've been in.
Have you been to Northeast DC?
Are you talking about like the bad neighborhoods? All bad neighborhoods look the same.
Are you sure about that? Try walking the streets of DC at 2 o'clock in the morning.
That's the same everywhere. I'm not walking the streets at 2 o'clock in the morning in places I don't know.
I'm just saying.
You'll never catch me in another person's neighborhood past nighttime.
I mean, even driving through Philadelphia when I went there. I mean, luckily I was in the car when I was driving for cheesesteak, but that was one of my needs. Astasia, I know you're looking to go back down to sunny, beautiful Myrtle Beach. So you've had no other consideration of possibly staying in New York?
I will not be up north. Absolutely.
Why
No
not?
more snow.
You just said absolutely not.
Done with the snow.
Is that the only reason that?
Pretty much.
So that's an interesting piece, because you look at these different places that you want to live in, and that's an example of one of the conditions that happen in our cities, right? How do you now handle an example of the fact that we've got global warming taking over our world, right? So now, cities that may not have gotten a lot of snow in the past are now getting snow. Karen, what happens if you move down to Alpharetta and it starts to snow?
I'm okay with that. It's the cost of living.
You
get
well,
more for your money.
Did you hear the story a couple years ago about the snowpocalypse?
No, I haven't.
This is a true story. I have family who lives down there, and a couple of my fraternity brothers down there. They closed school for 2 days because of half an inch of snow.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Dom told a kid on our team named Dom moved down to Atlanta, and he said while he was down there, it was like a super light snowstorm. But
And
the
they
city
closed
freaked out.
everything.
Yeah.
They don't have the facilities that we have to take care of it and like do it in a quick way. Like pop movements and then put whatever, I forget what it's called, what they put down on the road so the snow doesn't.
The
stick.
salt.
Yeah. No, not salt, something else.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. I know what you're
That,
talking
like they don't have any of that stuff. So when they get snow, they freak out.
about. Okay. So if it snowed in South Carolina, would you consider moving back up north?
Because you guys get snow all the time. If we get snow down there, it's a freak thing.
But what if it starts to happen on an ongoing basis?
It won't.
You don't know that.
I do.
Okay, cut me off.